chewing the letters. Five. 2 is Shemaiah.
Okay.
3 is Shavush. 4 is Orba.
Arba.
5 is
Kamesh.
7 is very important. 8 is
Shiva. Sounds almost like 7, doesn't it?
8 is Shalmone. 10 is, or 9, I think, 9 is, is it Tashay?
Tesha. Tesha.
10.
Eser. All right, pretty marvelous. Anybody ever heard from Les?
Yes, I talked with him today, and he's going to he is, and there was the president of Giddy. And
Wow.
they meet on Monday nights, but he's going to keep up with the class. So.
Okay, good. Well, this is an exciting night here, isn't it? Because we get to start in on verbs. That's pretty nifty, eh? Chapter 12 in the grammar. Page 121, huh?
Why do I not feel like we're done with nouns yet?
Well, we're not. Because remember, you still have to forget that stuff several times before you really own it. So you're well on your way then, huh? So, someday you'll own that stuff, but only after you've forgotten it several times. Anybody like to open us in prayer tonight? All right, Carl.
Father, we come to you tonight, thanking you, Lord, for this privilege we have of studying your word and learning more about the scriptures. And Father, we pray that you might be with each one of us, give us wisdom from you, that we might understand all that we hear. We thank you for it, Father, for we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks. Okay, page 121, chapter 12, Introduction to Hebrew Verbs. At this point in your study of Hebrew, you have hopefully mastered the essential elements of Hebrew nouns and nominals, huh? How about that? Now you have mastered the essentials of Hebrew nouns and nominals. See, that's a sense of accomplishment, isn't it? That's something to write home about. You can write home that I have mastered the essential elements of Hebrew nouns and nominals. And as soon as I figure out what a nominal is, I'll even be more excited. Right? It is now time to study the Hebrew verbal system. Verbs are those words used to describe an action you studied or state of being. She is wise. Because she already studied. In the Hebrew Bible, there are just over 23,000 verses. In the midst of these verses are found almost 72,000 verbs. Fortunately, some of them are repeated. This means that on average, there are approximately 3 verbs in each verse. These statistics demonstrate that you must understand the Hebrew verbal system in form, function, and meaning to succeed in the language. Well, we anticipated that, didn't we? In this chapter, you will learn about the basic grammatical issues relating to verbs. However, there is no need to memorize the Hebrew verbal forms in this chapter. Did you highlight that? Kind of feel bad for easing up on you so much, but what are you going to do? Okay, yeah, that's it. This is the moment. Okay, roots and stems. What's the difference between a root and a stem? Well, as I told you before, Hebrew words typically are formed using 3 consonants. You have many times the same 3 consonants, depending on the vocalization, the vowel points, may work for a noun or a verb. As you can see, the word melech is a noun. It means king. Malach means to reign. And you can see the connection there. All right? So melech is a stem, happens to be a noun. And you have various forms that come from that stem. You could have a feminine form meaning queen. You could have a plural form, right? Kings, malkim, and so forth, right? So melech is a stem, happens to be a noun. Malach is also a stem, happens to be a verb, and we're going to learn about all the different forms you can have based on that stem. The root of both of those is mem, lamed, kaf. See? So in a real text, you're never going to see a root, are you? A root is a theoretical thing, in a sense. Right? You can look at different words that are related, call them different stems from the same root. Right? Now, when you look up in BDB is going to give you the root and then the words, and that's how BDB is arranged, right? Basically, it gives you the root, and then it gives you the words that are derived from that root. Now, typically, the root is going to basically be the same as, without the vowel points, as the lexical form of the verb. Right? So basically, you're looking at the verb. When you look it up in BDB, I mean, that's the main entry. And then you see the nouns and stuff, the other stems that come from that same root. Now, do you understand the difference between a root and a stem then? All right, real words are roots, and the stems, and the root. Well, the root's underground. You don't really see it, right? It's there though, and that's where the stem comes from. Kind of botany kind of language, isn't it? Roots and stems. All right. Person, gender, and number. So verbs are inflected to show person, gender, and number. The chart on the top of page 123. You've read this chapter, I know, right? How did you feel about it when you read it? Did it make sense? There's a lot in it. All right. Go. If something is not making sense, and I'm not covering it, that you need to ask. We'll cover the basics of it here, though. All right. So in this chart, it tells us what we mean by person. So a verb is inflected for person. Now, if you've had Greek, not very many of you have. Maybe someday somebody will say, if you had Hebrew, then this will be familiar to you. But it's a similar thing. So verbs are inflected to show person. First, second, third person. Nouns are inflected to show person. Sort of, right? Well, not nouns, pronouns. Pronouns are inflected to show person. Nouns are not inflected to show person. Because we had first person, I, second person, you, and third person, he, she, it. Right? That's in the singular. So in a verb, first person, of course, would be I or we. Turns out that in English, you is both singular and plural, right? So first person is I or we, second person is you, and third person is he, she, it, or they. What does that mean? Well, first person means that the subject of the sentence or the subject of the verb, is also the speaker. I hit the ball. Okay. Second person means the subject of the verb is the person hearing the sentence. You hit the ball. Third person means the subject of the sentence is neither the speaker nor the hearer of the sentence. They may hear the sentence, but the sentence is not directed at them. He hit the ball. Right? Or she or it hit the ball. Okay, that's person. Gender, of course. Masculine refers to masculine. If the subject is masculine, the verb is going to be masculine. If the subject is feminine, the verb is going to be feminine. If the subject is masculine or feminine, the form of the verb may be common because there are some common forms. Just like in English, you is common from the standpoint of number. In other words, it's both singular and plural. There are some forms of the verb that are both masculine and feminine. We've already seen that with pronouns, haven't we? Now, when we're talking about masculine and feminine gender, that's a grammatical issue. Grammatical gender typically or often corresponds to real gender or sex, right? You know, the word mother is going to be feminine and the word father is going to be masculine. But, you know, why are other words masculine and other words feminine? You know, there may be, but it kind of tells you how, at least at some point in the Hebrew mind, those words may have been perceived, right? So grammatical gender and, you know, real gender or sex is not exactly the same thing, but there's often a correspondence between the two. And of course, number is just singular or plural. If you have a plural subject, the noun has to be plural. If you have a singular subject, I didn't say that right. If you have a plural subject, the verb has to be plural. If you have a singular subject, the verb has to be singular, right? As a typical rule.
Will you never have dual verb?
No. If you have a dual noun, a dual subject, you need a plural verb. It's a good question. All right. Now, verbal stems. It's kind of funny that we're using that word, you know, in two different ways in the same chapter, because when we talked about stems, well, you know, we just used it differently on the last page. But here, we're going to use stems slightly differently. Paragraph 12.5. In the Hebrew verbal system, there are 7 major stems. The kal stem, the nifal stem, the pl stem, the pual stem, the hifil stem, hafil, really the hofal stem, and the hitpael stem. All right? Now, the kal stem is the basic or simple verbal stem. From the kal stem, all other verbal stems are formed. For this reason, the nifal through the hitpael stems are called derived stems because their forms are derived or based on the kal stem. Okay, if you look on page 124, the next page, you will see the English name of the stem, the Hebrew spelling of that name. Actually, it's the Hebrew name of the stem with the English spelling, really, isn't it? So the kal stem is spelled in Hebrew like you see it there, kal, right? And that means unaugmented. So that's just your basic typical stem. It's somewhat unfortunate that the rest of them use a different paradigm word for the formation of those names other than kal. I mean, it's fitting in a sense because kal is the basic one that all the rest are derived from. All right. But you can see in the name. Can you see in the names of all of those, the rest of those stems, that it really uses the same root word, right? Pei, ayin, lamed. Do you see that? So the nifal stem adds a noon to the beginning of it and has that kind of pointing that you see right there. All right. The Pal stem just changes the pointing in the way that you see right there. Now, if the middle, in some sense it's unfortunate that this is the word that we chose to do this with, because it's a weak verb with a middle guttural. So typically a Pal has a dogish in the middle root letter, in the second root letter. But it's not going to show up if you have a guttural or resh, right? So it's not showing up here in this in the name Nifal, right?
Is that a tone on Nifal that usually happens, or on a lot of names?
No, some other ones have it too. The Pual is spelled like you see right there. The Hifil adds a hey to the beginning of it, and then there's a Hirik Yod vowel under the middle root letter. So that looks pretty distinctive. The Hafal is spelled like you see there, or I should call it the Hofal, really, because that's a Kametz Ketuf, isn't it? For some reason I learned it Hafal, and that's really not how it's pronounced. It's Hofal. And then there is the Hit Pa'el, and that's distinctive because it adds a Hey and a Tav. There are all kinds of other stems that might show up in various verbs, because just, that's the way the verb is spelled in a different way or whatever.
How come the call is the Kosh Lamed, not the Pei Ayin?
Well, it's because it's just a different word that means unaugmented. So that's what I was saying. The cow really, the name cow is derived from a different word than the rest of them derive their name from. So it's distinguished from but it's distinguished from the rest of them because it's the main one that the rest of them are derived from. So what's the cow form of this Pei Ayin Lamed word? What would that be called? That would be the Pa'al. If you use the same word, it'd be the Pa'al stem. But they don't call it. They call it the cow stem. Pa'al usually with a kametz and a patak.
The cow stem is the lexical form.
Right. Usually, yeah.
But the book also said something that it's not always a cow stem, or not always a cow form of a verb. So if there's no cow form, what's the lexical?
Infinitive construct. You had to ask, didn't you?
Remind me when we get there.
So what's the call construct? Is it like first person or second person? Or is it these definitions?
No, these are all perfects. 3MS. So the cow, I guess you call it a cow perfect 3MS, Nifal perfect 3MS, PL perfect 3MS. If you're going to parse those. Right? Now don't worry about this because each one of these is going to be at least a chapter, or maybe more than one chapter. Right? So we're going to cover the Nifal pretty soon. Right? It's going to have its own little chapter, and we're going to look at it and see how it all inflects and all the happy stuff that happens. Right? Remember this chapter is giving you basically an overview of the whole verbal system. All right? So we have most of the next term and a half to get all of this stuff. Okay. Now you can see the cow stem is the simple active stem. So, for example, in that paragraph, it gives you the word shama. Now, see what the cow stem looks like in a 3-consonant word. So that's why I said if it were using the pa'al word, it would be pa'al. It would have the same pointing, I assume, as shama. All right. So what does shema mean? Well, shema is cow, third masculine singular form. It means he heard. Okay. So see how that's simple active? He heard. He saw. He made. He walked. He said. Simple. All right, the nifal is simple passive or maybe reflexive. Okay? So if you took the word shema and made it a nifal and made it a nishma, see what happened to that? Same vowel pointings as the nifal. That's why it's important to know these stems and to pronounce them right. Same vowel pointing as the nifal with the noon in front of it. And now Shema becomes not he heard, but he was heard. See? Passive. Or if it's reflexive, he heard himself. But that's probably not likely for that word. There's probably going to be a word whose meaning lends itself particularly to to a reflexive sense, or the context is going to push you in that direction. All right. So that's the nifal is basically the passive version of the cal stem. Right. Remember we had passive verbs in Greek. We might have a present passive indicative. Well, that's what the nifal just means passive. All right. The PL is not simple, but it's intensive. Intensive, active. Okay. So in this paragraph, he gives shavar in the cal as meaning he broke, but if you make it PL, shaber, there's the dogish. See it come out in the bait right there. So how do you recognize a PL? Because it has the vowel points of PL, right, and a dogish in the middle, root letter. Okay. So instead of meaning he broke in the PL, it would mean he shattered to pieces or something like that. You see? It's active though. Yes.
Back to the Nepal. When you change from Nepal to the Nepal, the shin takes a shavar.
Yeah, it's spelled just like the word nifal over here in terms of the vowel points.
But why isn't the autox there? Or does it have to be? Does it have to be?
Well, that's how nifal is spelled. That's why you call it a nifal. You didn't call it a nafal, right?
You'd have too much.
Well, that's just the way they spell it. They can spell it however they want. But that's probably why. It's probably, there's imbalance to the word.
So it's just to shorten your vowel when you're speaking.
Yeah, I mean when you're changing, we saw before with words, when you're adding and subtracting consonants of the word, even when you're adding suffixes and stuff like that, pronominal suffixes, when you do that, when you change the spelling of the consonants, you're probably going to be changing the vowel pointing. Just so it works together. Yeah.
You'd have it back to back.
Right.
Okay. All right.
Is it pretty consistent? Because this is actually kind of neat. Yeah.
It is neat.
Once you start studying individually, you find out the number of exceptions. Because otherwise
there was a whole chapter for
Yeah, just remember this is an overview of the verbal system, but it is pretty cool.
It says the Hebrew professor.
Well, we'll show you in a minute. All right. So if you know these stems, cal, nifal, pl, and know how to spell them in Hebrew, right? And know what they mean. So the PL is going to be intensive and active. Okay. The pual is going to be intensive and passive. So if shavar means, that's in the cal, he broke, and shaber, same word in the PL, means he smashed into pieces, then shuvar, sounds like 50s music, doesn't it? Shuvar. Then shuvar is going to mean it or he was smashed into pieces. Okay, so it's still intensive, but now it's passive. You see that? You're going to have to relax your shoulders and just kind of let it sink in. Right. So the nifal is the passive version of the cal, and the pual is the passive version of the pl. Cal is simple active. PL is intensive active. All right? That's 4 of the 7 down.
How come on intensive cast could be he is smashed into pieces?
Well, we're going to have, it could also be it. It depends on what you're talking about. He's suggesting it because usually a person doesn't get smashed into pieces. Something does. But
was it like the was it present tense or past tense? Well, I guess it's he is smashed into pieces. He was.
Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay. Tense. We're going to talk about tense. Verbs have stem and tense. And we haven't talked about tense yet, so we'll get there. All right. The hifil is now not simple or intensive, but causative active. Okay. So if malak means he reigned or he was king, then himlik means he caused to reign, or to make that smoother conceptually, he made someone king, or he anointed someone king, or however you want to say that. Right? He crowned him king, you could say. But the concept is he made him king. Okay. If you have the word for to walk in the cal, in the hifil, it would mean he caused him to walk. Right? And from there you can really, you might say, well, it's better in English to say he caused him to walk, well, he took him, or something like that. But the essential concept is causative, active. Now the hofal is going to be causative, passive. So if himlik means he made someone king, homlock, he was made king. See that? Now, mostly you're going to see cal verbs, you're going to see PL verbs, and you're going to see hifil verbs. And nifal verbs. Those 4 are going to be your main ones. Because most of the verbs are going to be active, right? You're going to see puals, yeah. Are you going to see hofals? Yeah. But not very often compared to the other ones. And then the hitpael is now an intensive reflexive. So this is the reflexive version of the PL, isn't it? So we have hitpael. So if chava in the cal stem means he hid, then the hitpael form, which we pronounce hitkave, that means he hid himself. And it doesn't come across in English, but the hid is more intensified at that point. He really hid himself. Right? Notice the dogish in that form as well. Right? So, just for a second, if you look over in that chart on the middle of page 127, let's look at the dagashim, shall we? In the second root letter. The PL gets a dogish in the second root letter. See that? Shaver. The pual gets a dogish in the second root letter. Shubar. And the hitpael gets a dogish in the second root letter. Hitkabe. Now, what observation can you make then? What kind of words get a dogish? No? Intensive. The stems that intensify the verb, the verbal idea, get a dogish in the second root letter. You see that? The PL, the pual, and the hitpael. All right. Any questions so far? Now, if all we had was the stems in third masculine singular, we'd be home free, wouldn't we? But remember, we're having gender, person, and number, or person, gender, and number, all right, in other words. So we're going to have forms for first, second, third person. We're We're going to have forms for masculine, feminine, gender. And we're going to have forms for singular and plural for each of the stems. But then we're going to throw in tenses. So in each one of those paradigms, you're going to have perfect tense, imperfect tense, infinitives, participles, stuff like that. All right, top of page 127 then. Active voice, cal, PL, and hifil. But the cal is simple, the PL is intensive, and the hifil is causative. Passive voice, simple passive is the nifil, the intensive passive is the pual, and the causative passive is the hofal. Reflexive voice, nifal can also serve as a reflexive, simple, and an intensive reflexive is a hit pa-el. So look at all those in the intensive column, PL, pual, hit pa-el. Those all get a dogish. So you can see the spelling or the vocalization of them by the pronunciation of the stem name, P-ale. Now, there's a missing consonant in English because we don't have a consonant for the ion, right? Because it's guttural. So P-ale, you can see the typical vocalization of that. But there's a dogish there. Pual, dogish. Hit pa-el. Now, the hit pa-el is pretty easy to recognize, isn't it? Because, you know, how many words are you going to add a hey tob to the front of it? You see that? Hit pa-el. There you go. Right? It feels pretty easy to recognize. You know, when the verbs form regularly, right? Because you have a hey on the front of it and you have a hirik yod. That, you know, that just screams out hifil, right? In the hifil. See how it's spelled over here on page 124? Huh? Well, that's where you're supposed to be. But since you asked the question of how to spell hifil, there you see that it's spelled on 124. All right. So if you're confused about how to translate them, he summarizes that in the next chart. So the cal, he changes vocabulary because, as this will suggest, not all verbs are found in all of these stems because the verbal idea just doesn't work in all these stems. Some verbs aren't even found in the cal stem. For example, the word to speak, the typical word for to speak, deber, is in the PL for some reason. But Shema, he heard. Nishma, the nifal, he was heard. Sheber, PL, he smashed into pieces. And Shubar, he was smashed into pieces. That's also suggesting to us that the masculine form of the verb can also serve for a neuter subject. Right? We don't have a neuter gender in Hebrew, right? But in English we do. So, you know, where, you know, a word might be, a noun might be, masculine or feminine when it relates to an inanimate object. In English, we would translate it, not he or she, even though it's feminine or masculine in Hebrew. Right? So you can have a masculine verb, and you might want to translate it instead of he, if it's an inanimate object that it refers to. So he or it was smashed into pieces. That's passive, right? Now the hifil is going to be causative. He made somebody king. The hofal is going to be passive causative. He was made king. The hit pa-el is going to be intensive passive. He hid himself. Now, are there any questions so far on these things? You're getting a sense of how this is going to work, right? All right. So, 12:10. The meaning of a verb in the cal may be different when the same verb appears in another stem. That's kind of a poorly worded sentence, but hopefully you can get the idea. This is one of the major reasons why it is important to understand the verbal stems as presented above. For example, the Hebrew verb shavar in the cal means to break. The same verb in the PL stem, shaber, means to smash into pieces. In this and many other instances, the relationship between the two meanings is apparent in light of the discussion above. In other instances, however, understanding the change in verbal meaning between the different stems is not apparent. For example, the verb barak means to kneel in the cow. The same verbal root in the PL stem means to bless. Now you might be able to think of a logical flow from the idea of kneeling and to bless, but you could never anticipate it, right? It's like when you have a prepositional prefix on a Greek verb. Once you know the meaning, you say, oh, I see where they got that, but you can't necessarily anticipate where the meaning is going to go before you look it up, and it's the same with this. Okay. Having studied verbal stems and how they affect verbal meaning, we now turn to the verbal conjunctions and how to denote verbal function. In other words, verbal stems are used to indicate verbal meaning, and verbal conjunctions are used to denote verbal function. What's the difference? Meaning, the meaning being something like to bless or to kneel or to break or something like that. The function meaning, is it going to go with a singular or plural, masculine or feminine, first person, second person, third person subject? Right? That's what he's talking about. And then there's the issue of tense as well. All right. Let's look at 12:11. We should probably read that. Be certain we're aware of that. In English, verbs are conjugated in order to express different verbal functions. The term conjugation is used to describe the inflected verbal forms that express particular verbal functions. Some verbal conjugations are also used to express what is called tense. The term tense is used to indicate the relationship between the time of the verbal action and the time of the speaking. For example, an English verb may be conjugated in the present tense in order to express action taking place but not yet complete. That is, incomplete or imperfect action. All right? So I study, we study. The same verb may be conjugated in the past tense in order to express that which is completed. I studied, we studied. This verb is also conjugated in the future tense in order to express action not yet begun but expected in the future. I will study, we will study. All right? Bottom of that page, English verbs may also be conjugated as participles, studying, infinitives, to study, or imperatives, study, or even gerunds, right? Try to explain the difference between a gerund and a participle in English. That's a little bit tough. Anybody an English person in here? Maybe you can explain the difference between a gerund and a participle. But in Greek and Hebrew, the function of a participle takes in both the function of the gerund and the participle in English. That's why I'll probably never understand it in English. All right, continuing on. In Hebrew, there are 8 basic verbal conjugations. You ready? Perfect, imperfect, imperative, cohortative, jussive, infinitive construct, infinitive absolute, and participle. This means that a verb in the cal may be conjugated in any one of 8 different ways. So we have 7 stems times 8 tenses. So that would give us 7 times 8 potential conjugations. It's not going to be as bad as that, though. Some of the conjugations are small. All right. In most cases, top of page 129, in most cases, the change in verbal function will be identifiable by a change in the verbal form. Each of the derived stems, nifal, pl, pual, etc., may also be conjugated in any one of these 8 different conjugations. In Hebrew, therefore, there are 7 verbal stems and 8 verbal conjugations. For example, the cal verb shema may be conjugated in any one of 8 different ways, depending on the intended function of the verb. Cal participle, cal infinitive, cal imperative, etc. The same verb in the nifal stem may also be conjugated in any one of 8 different Hebrew conjugations. All right? So the following chapters will take you step by step through each verbal stem and each verbal conjugation. At this point, however, it will be helpful to briefly define the function of each Hebrew verbal conjugation. So, ready for the perfect? The perfect conjugation is used to express a completed action or state of being. When used to describe a completed action, either in reality or in the mind of the speaker, the Hebrew perfect may be translated by the English past tense. The thing you need to get about these Hebrew tenses is that they really don't have any time significance in and of themselves. I think there probably is I think it's typical if you're talking about something in the past tense to use a perfect tense verb, and if you want to talk about something in the future tense to use an imperfect verb, because that timing, that time frame issue kind of fits with the kind of action, right? But in Hebrew verbs, tense is indicating kind of action and not time of action. Okay? The verb itself and the meaning of the verb and the context are what really define for you the time of the action. And that's what has to make it clear. Okay, so the perfect tense is denoting completed action. Look at the bottom of that paragraph. It says the perfect aspect, and he's calling it an aspect because tense really refers to time, doesn't it? All right, so he calls it an aspect. The perfect aspect denotes completed action, whether in the past, present, or future. But you're not going to see the perfect tense used for the future very often, probably. All right. Well, as you might guess, the imperfect tense is the conjugation used to express incomplete action, and is usually translated by the English present tense, or even the future tense. I study or I will study. The action of the verb occurs either at the time of speaking or after the time of speaking. The Hebrew imperfect is also used to denote habitual or customary action, whether in the past, present, or future. Bottom of that paragraph on the next page, the imperfect aspect denotes incomplete action, whether in the past, present, or future. Okay. Now, the imperative is simply a command, but you use the imperative form for a second person command. Now in English, the imperative is always second person, right? Shut the door. If we have to use a circumlocution in English if we want to use a first person imperative. Let's go to the store. Or a third person imperative. Let him, let the man who hears obey, or something like that, right? In Hebrew, a second person command is called the imperative, and the first person command is called the cohortative, and the third person command is called the jussive. All right? I think that's fairly straightforward. Any issues with that? Anybody have any issues with that? You can see the examples he gives. First person, let us honor the Lord. Third person, may the Lord give to me another son. Okay? So you can see that those conjugations are going to be relatively small because they're only going to be operating in one person, right? Second person or first person or third person. Whereas the perfect and the imperative are operating in the first, second, or third person. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Now, the conjugations get very small. As in Greek, there aren't very many forms of the infinitive, right? The infinitive means it's not limited by matching a subject. It doesn't have a subject, theoretically, right? As it's defined. So the infinitive construct is called a verbal noun, just as in Greek or English, an infinitive is a verbal noun. So it's a verb in the infinitive form, but it can function somewhat like a noun. So an infinitive is a verbal noun. In Hebrew, there are two infinitive forms, the infinitive construct and the infinitive absolute. The infinitive construct may function much like an English infinitive, usually translated with the preposition to plus a verb, as in to study or to learn. Like a noun, it can be used as the subject. To study is hard work. You see that? Or the object of a verb, I want to study. So you see how we've taken a verbal idea and kind of made it so we can use it in a noun slot in the sentence. Right? It may also be used in a number of other ways, and we'll talk about that later. Infinitive absolute, the Hebrew infinitive absolute has no real English counterpart. It may be used in conjunction with other verbs to emphasize or intensify the verbal action. It may also be used in place of an imperative to express a command. In special instances, it can be used with other verbs to express two verbal actions occurring at the same time, that is, contemporaneous action. So if you have an infinitive absolute, oftentimes you'll have an infinitive absolute, the same vocabulary word used in a verb, and an infinitive absolute, one after the other. Right? And that's to intensify the verbal idea. In fact, in Genesis, we won't take the time to look at it, but in Genesis, where God says to Adam and Eve, don't eat the fruit off the tree. The day you eat of it, you shall surely die. Well, that's the verb to die, and the infinitive absolute, one after the other. So literally, it's dying, you will die. What that means is, the day you eat of it, you will surely die. And that's that construction right there. So that's where the infinitive absolute. All right, and finally, we get the participle, which is a verbal adjective. So, as you might expect, an infinitive construct, at least, is going to be used in many of the ways that a noun is used. And a participle, being a verbal adjective, is going to be used like an adjective. So how can adjectives be used? An adjective can be used attributively, all right, the good man, or in a predicate sense, the man is good, or even substantively. What does that mean? The good, the bad, and the ugly are coming over for dinner. Right? So those are all adjectives, but I use them as nouns to be the subject of that sentence, right? So that's the way a participle works, similarly to the way it works in Greek and in English. All right, so we have the perfect, the imperfect, the imperative, cohortative, jussive, infinitive construct, infinitive absolute, and participle. Participle conjugations are very small, too. Wow, huh? Think how impressive it's going to be when you're going to know all this stuff in a few weeks. Huh?
When will that be exact?
Well, that would exactly be about 10 weeks plus whatever is left of this term, so probably about 15 weeks. A couple of days for break in there. Probably in the space of about 5 more months. By the time 5 months is up, you're all going to be just Hebrew studs. You're going to all have this down. You will have forgotten this so many times that you're going to own it forever. Yes?
When we're done with the series that this seminary requires, comparatively speaking, how is our Hebrew with other seminaries? I mean, will we be able to really, what is the goal for us? Your goal for us?
Well, that's a great question. I only know that there's a trend that's typical for seminaries, and that is there is the less of an emphasis on biblical languages in seminaries. So now in some seminaries, maybe most seminaries, and I don't know, I don't look at the catalogs of a lot of seminaries, but it could be even almost all seminaries, I don't know, but at least a lot of seminaries. You can get an MDiv now without even really studying, taking Greek and Hebrew. I mean, you might have a class where you study Greek and Hebrew study tools or something like that, but they actually take a Hebrew course or a Greek course of study You can get a Master's of Divinity without that. Well, the great thing about this seminary is that it does emphasize the biblical languages. So that tells you where you're going to come out if you want to think of it in terms of compared to other seminaries. Now, in those seminaries, is it possible to take a lot of biblical languages? Probably. So if you choose to do it, you could probably take as much as you're going to end up taking going through this seminary. Here you just don't have a choice.
Well, that's good. So you consider this a lot of language, though. The seminary will have a lot of language.
Well, compared to what's happening out there, yeah. Compared to the average pastor, on the block, you'll have a lot of language. And you could ask another question: are you going to have enough? Well, I think it's a great goal if you can learn enough Hebrew, if you can learn enough Greek, so that it actually saves you time when you're writing sermons and Bible studies. If you can get to that place, then it becomes self-perpetuating because you're going to use it. If you get out of seminary and you remain at the place where it still costs, it takes you twice as much time to prepare your sermon or to do the exegesis if you use Hebrew or Greek. If you're at that place, when you get out into the pressures of ministry, unless you're an incredibly disciplined person, which most of us are not, you're going to use it less and less, and probably a lot less real quick when you get into pressures of ministry. So if it's not saving you time, then I don't think it is self-perpetuating. And the more you go without using it, the more you're going to lose it. It's remarkable to me after so many years how much I've not learned of things I've studied. I can go back to Psalms. I took a course on the Psalms from Ron Allen when I was in seminary, and it was an awesome thing. And he just, he made us do so much translation, and we had exams over so many verses. I mean, we would study for days just to get through the material that we were. We'd already translated it daily, but to study for the test, we would study for hours and hours and hours on end just to get through the material once that we were going to be tested on for translation, and then go back and do it again because you need to know it better, But when I get to those Psalms that we translated, there's a world of difference between trying to translate a Psalm that I've never translated before, So it's really remarkable what you remember. So, if you work hard and really get to the place where it's not killing you to use your Greek and Hebrew in everyday ministry, then it becomes self-perpetuating, and then you're going to keep it and get better with it. For me, particularly in the New Testament, if you wanted to kill me, take away my Greek New Testament and tell me to go prepare a sermon. At that point, I'm taking forever, and I won't even get close to the quality I think I would have with it. And it would take me forever to do it. Give me my Greek New Testament, I've just cut probably 5 to 10 hours off of putting a sermon together. And it's similarly true for me with Hebrew, but I must admit that I'm not as far along with my Hebrew as I am with my Greek. And I regret that. And the reason for that is I was not able to take Hebrew in college. See, so I didn't have it as long of a period. They did not for it. I would have, but they did not for it.
So where did you do that?
Seminary. So that meant the whole time I was in seminary, basically, I was studying Hebrew. But the whole time I was in seminary, I was studying Greek. And I'd already studied Greek for 2 years. So it just gave me that 2-year head start, Probably takes 5 years of study, continual study, to really get Greek or Hebrew really under your belt. And that's the problem, going through seminary in 3 years and not taking it till you start seminary. So you're going to, you may finish seminary and you may have to gut it through, do some study on your own. But hopefully by then, you can see the value of it, and maybe it'll be equal. Maybe it's not saving you time, but it's not costing you too much time. And with computer programs, in some sense, that's helpful too, because we can be, instead of looking through a lexicon, looking everything up and taking all that time, we can point a cursor to it and get a meaning. Now, again, let's not change the doctrine of the church just based on a computer program, because there are mistakes in it, right? But nonetheless, it is very helpful. So those computer programs will probably make it easier for us to keep it on computer, but they also allow us to be lazy and rely too much on a computer program and not really keep up on our Hebrew, right? Or Greek. So if we use them to our benefit. But it makes a huge difference. In terms of preaching and teaching the Bible, I can pretty much make a living telling people who don't know Greek and Hebrew what they can't see in their Bible and is obvious if you're looking at it in Greek and Hebrew. I can make a living doing that. I mean, you got to throw in a little application, have a joke or two, but I can really make a living just doing that. I mean, if I were going to teach a class on the book of Ephesians, I could make a living just sitting here with my Greek, New Testament. And since you don't probably know Greek as well as I do, I could sit there going through Ephesians in my Greek New Testament, telling you what's obvious to me that you can't see. And then that'd be a seminary class, basically. So there's a lot of value in being able to do that. And to me, what you give people in your ministry is so much more solid and substantial. You'll rarely ever hear me, stand in the pulpit and say that's an aorist or that's a Cal Perfect 3MS or something like that. I mean, I mention words like agape and stuff like that, that people are going to know. But it's just, it's just a matter of translating it from what you see in the original text to what the people who hear you can relate to. That's more difficult. I'll tell you that it's much easier for me if I'm teaching a Greek class. For example, when we're going through the book of 1 John in beginning Greek, that's a piece of cake. If I have people that are looking at their Greek New Testament and they're learning Greek, and I'm teaching 1 John, that's a piece of cake for me, comparatively. It gets a lot harder when I'm looking at my Greek New Testament and everybody's sitting out there as a King James or a New American Standard or an NIV or whatever. Right? Because now I've got to do the whole, I can't say, see that? No, that's an aorist. And the significance of that is that I've got to figure out how to communicate that same thing without using the word aorist or whatever. Now I have when I'm teaching through 1 John Wednesday night, and tenses are very important to 1 John, so I have tried to explain, to the people the significance of the present tense and the aorist tense and the perfect tense and all that kind of stuff, But that's not where I make my living, teaching them about how Greek works. Does that answer your question? That's probably a really long answer to a short question.
Well, yeah. Well, it was the answer. I told you. It's exciting. It was exciting to hear. I mean, it was for the same reason. It's exciting to hear. It's very encouraging.
Well, Sunday night, every fifth Sunday night, which happens about once a quarter, we're having a Sunday night service where people get to come and we'll sing favorite songs. And so people get to pick the music. And then ahead of time, they write out questions to me and put them in a box in the back of the church. And I take those questions that they have and answer them. And some of them are doozies. I didn't get to all of them last night, fortunately. One was, what happens to a pregnant woman at the rapture? Or what happens to a baby or a toddler or something, at the rapture or whatever. But
all Scripture gives my inspiration, profitable for instruction. There you go. It's going to be there.
Well, it doesn't say everything you want to know, isn't it? But one person asked from 1 Samuel, did God really send an evil spirit to Saul? And I was able to answer that question, I think, very soundly and quickly just by reading the verses or the particular verse in question in Hebrew. Because it said something like, I don't know if I can remember exactly what it said, something like, and God caused to turn aside, God caused the Holy Spirit to turn aside from with Saul, and he sent an evil spirit, how it's translated, or something like an evil spirit was sent from with Yahweh. So the Holy Spirit from with Saul and the evil spirit from with Yahweh was sent to terrify Saul. Okay? So in other words, this evil spirit was in the presence of Yahweh before being sent to Saul. Now that doesn't mean it can't be an evil spirit, but if you look at the word evil, it is a homonym, even a homograph, and one of the words that's spelled that way can mean evil. The other word that's spelled that way can mean attendant. So it could have been an attendant spirit.
It was Ra?
Yeah, it was Ra'ah. Re, Hai, and Hey. But I don't think we've had that particular word yet, but it's similar to one of the words we've had. Or it can mean an evil spirit, or it can mean to do harm. So immediately I understood that to mean that the spirit itself might not have been evil by nature, but it was sent to do harm to Saul. Now that challenges our view of God a little bit too, that God actually sent a spirit for the purpose of doing harm to Saul. But remember, Saul had already been impatient and sacrificed without the priest being there, Samuel. Right? So you can see the significance of that God not only took the Holy Spirit from Saul, but He sent a spirit to harm Saul, and that harm apparently was in the form of terrifying Saul. But as soon as you read the verse and see that the Holy Spirit went from with Saul, very same language, this evil spirit was sent from with Yahweh, right? So that spirit that Yahweh sent was with Yahweh in the same way the Holy Spirit, or at least grammatically, in the same way that the Holy Spirit was with Saul. And then you look at the meaning of Ra'ah, and that doesn't necessarily have to mean that the spirit itself was evil by nature. In other words, it didn't have to be a demon. It could have been, a right or righteous or good angel sent to actually be nasty to Saul. Now, it could have been an evil one too, and if that's the case, that's what happened. But at least you see the option. Right? So it took a kind of a vexing question, and when you could look at it grammatically and find a very satisfying solution to it. You could also find a theological solution to it as well, and that's why your study of theology is very important too. And that is very important, by the way. I don't want to go into why so much now, but if you don't have a good sense of theology under your belt, in some sense exegesis could take you anywhere. It's theology that keeps you on the right path. You see what I mean? And I've been in school with a lot of people who didn't have a good theological undergirding, and their tendency was just go bam, 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 bam all over the place. Then you start asking questions, you go, about the implications of where they're going, and they start going, never thought, okay, that can't be right. So all of it's very important. But even theology is undergirded by language study, because where do we get our theology? From the text. Right? If you're really going to be in ministry and be a leader in the church, it's remarkably difficult. Maybe everybody thinks their job is hard, but it is remarkably difficult because the amount of academic ability that's required if you're really going to do a good job is amazing. By the time you get out of seminary, you could almost be a medical doctor in terms of what you're required to go through. Seriously. And then you throw in the whole thing of dealing with people who are all volunteers. That's the other thing you really have to develop, is you really have to learn to be good with people. And most of the people in ministry have to learn that. I don't know if it can come naturally. You really have to learn that. And if you're going to wash out in ministry, that's probably going to be the reason, because you can't deal well with people. It's probably not going to be because you didn't prepare your sermons from your Greek text, honestly. It's going to be because you don't understand people and know how to deal with them. I think it's a remarkably difficult challenge. In fact, others have said that leading in the church is the hardest leadership challenge that there is, basically. The easiest being military. Now, that's not easy in every sense. But when you're in the military, all you got to do is tell people what to do, and if they're below you, they do it. And if somebody tells you what to do and they're above you, you do it. So in a sense, that's easy leadership. You get in the church, And, in business, at least you're paying people. You can fire them. You get in the church, you just hope that they're motivated enough by God to want to do something, right? So, it becomes very difficult because it's really all based on, are people motivated, and can you motivate them to do what you do? So, if you're leading and no one's following, you're really just on a long walk, right? Might as well be playing golf. So that's why we have to work so hard. But you know what? It does give you credibility. I had an elder in my church, and he's not there now. But I had an elder in my church who was a seminary graduate, great guy. But he had some kind of strange ideas about a few things. He'd whip out his Greek New Testament. He wasn't awesome in Greek. I'll tell you what, I was a lot better than him in Greek and Hebrew. So when he whipped out his stuff, I said, "Bring it on. Let's talk." And it gives you credibility. When somebody asks a question and I can whip out my Greek or Hebrew Bible at church in a Bible study or something like that and say, "Let me check it out," and look and tell them, I think it cuts down on a lot of theological arguments in the church. So I think it gives you a lot of credibility if you can operate that way. And it should. Okay, well, that was a nice break from all of these verbal things. Almost finished, I think. Page 131. Another issue that we have to think about is strong and weak verbs. Hebrew verbs are classified as either strong or weak. Strong verbs have no weak consonants. Weak verbs, however, have at least one weak root consonant. So strong verbs are katal. Well, the weak consonants are gutturals and resh. So katal doesn't have a guttural or a resh. That's a strong verb. Katav, kavaz. What stem are all those in? Cal. That's right. So you can pick up the pattern already. So that's cal perfect 3ms right there. Okay. Weak verbs are shema. See the ayin at the end. Matzah, Allah. What stem are those in? Cal. Right. All right. Now the consonants yod and nun are also considered weak, but only when they appear as the first consonant of the verbal root. So yashav is a weak verb, and nafal is a weak verb. If you have a geminate root like savav, that's considered a weak verb. And then sometimes you have biconsonantal roots like kam. All these are cal, by the way. That's also considered. Kam is also considered to be a hollow verb because the dictionary form is going to be kum with a shurik in the middle of it, and that's and you ask what form you're going to get when you don't get the cal form, cal perfect form. Well, that's the infinitive construct form to show what letter you get in there. But that it's weak means that letter drops out. Now, what's the significance of it being weak? Well, one of the significances of weak verbs is those letters that are weak can disappear, and strange things can happen with those letters. Right? They can drop out, and things happen.
So, the Germans, I got a question. How do you pronounce it? Would that be Sabav or Sav?
Sabav. Yep. Okay, so classification of weak verbs. Now the Roman numerals have to do with the first letter, second letter, third letter. 3 letters, right? 3 consonants. Right? So a Roman numeral 1 guttural, that is the word is going to start. The first letter is going to be a guttural. So Ahmad is an example of that. So you have a guttural in the first position. Roman numeral 2 guttural, that means you have a guttural in the second position, or called the root position. Now remember that the second consonant is the root consonant, and the vowel under it is the root vowel. Okay. And then a Roman numeral 3 chet ayin has obviously a chet or an ayin in the third position. For example, barach. Roman numeral 3 aleph has an aleph in the third position. For example, matzah. And Roman numeral 3, hey, has a hey in the third position, for example, bana. Remember, yod and nun are only considered weak if they occur at the beginning of the word, so yashav is a weak verb and nafal is a weak verb. Then you can have a doubly weak verb because there are two gutturals or weak consonants in the verb. Allah would be an example of that. And biconsonantal, consonantal, or however you want to say that, com has only two root consonants. The footnote, these verbs are also called hollow. And then the geminate verbs, savav. Why? Because it wouldn't be unusual for those two identical consonants for one of them to drop out. We see that in the vocabulary word lave or levav, right? They both mean heart. That's a geminate noun, and sometimes the other bait just drops out because they don't need the doubling, right? So there's an alternate spelling. Yeah.
Now, resh is weak. I don't see resh anywhere.
Well, it doesn't give you an example of it, but the resh should be treated like those other. I feel the ratios are. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Probably should have given an example of that, but he didn't.
Then you've got bara. That would not be considered doubly.
Well, maybe that's a bad example. I don't know. Yeah, that's a good point. All right, word order in the Hebrew verbal system. We know the order in English. In Hebrew, you normally have verb, subject, object. And we saw that, and he gives us the very first verse of the Bible, and we saw that. Bara, what stem is bara? Cal. Okay. What tense is it? Any guess? Perfect. Cal, perfect. 3MS. God created. Now, we left out the first word in the beginning, right? But that doesn't matter. It showed you the order. Verb, bara, Elohim, subject, 8, hashemayim. Now, 8 is our direct object marker, isn't it? Right? And so the object is hashemayim. Now, 8 wouldn't have to be there. If you just had bara, Elohim, hashemayim, it would be God created the heavens. Right? Of course, there's a double object, the 8 haaretz.
We'll talk about it. There really is no significance in having a direct object marker there. It doesn't change anything without it. It's just a stylistic issue.
Well, it's helpful because there isn't any doubt that it was God that created the heavens, not the heavens and earth that created God. So it can't possibly be an argument the other way. And if you look at the top page 133, here's another example. You could have differences in word order. So et Adonai Elohecha, Tira. Yahweh, your God, you shall fear. So what's happened there? You have the direct object marker. So we know that Yahweh is the object, right? And Elohim, we have Elohet Ka. What's the Ka? That's right, it's a 2MS. It's the 2MS pronominal suffix, your. And Elohim is plural, and that's why we have the Segol Yod there, right? So, your God. And then Yara is the word to fear, so Tira, you shall fear. You will fear, and so that is going to be what? An imperative, isn't it? You will fear the Lord your God. Now, the Lord your God comes first here, but we know it's the object because it has a direct object marker, definite direct object marker. Right, in this example, observe how the direct object precedes the verb for the purposes of emphasis. A discussion of issues related to sentence syntax is presented in chapter 3. So even though you have a typical order, verb, subject, object, that can be, for various reasons, changed.
Will it at times be missing and you'll have to rely on order for interpretation?
The verb of being is often missing. And the subject is often expressed only in the verb. Because in English, we don't have person, number, and gender within our verbs. Sometimes we have number, right? But not person and gender. Well, in Hebrew, you're going to have gender, number, and person all within the verb. So you really don't need an express subject. So you can have, he did this or she did that, without having a noun functioning as the subject. So you may not have an express subject, and oftentimes, we've already seen it, you don't have a verb of being expressed. So all kinds of things can happen in terms of word order. But the context should make it clear. Just like here, it's clear that God is not the subject of that. First of all, because the verb is second person, right? And God would be third person. So God can't be the subject of a second person verb. God, because the word God would require a third person, right? Unless you're saying, I, God, blah, blah, blah. Or you, God, blah, blah, blah. But just to say God did something, that has to be third person. Right? Does that make sense? So there are various clues to how this has to work. One of them is the definite direct object marker, and the other is that the verb is second person. So I know Adonai Eloheka cannot be the subject of the sentence. Now, I hope that we're getting the proper effect here. Really, in beginning Hebrew. Now, you're supposed to be getting the stuff eventually, but you're also supposed to be overwhelmed. So, if we're not accomplishing that, we're going to have to do something here. So, are you sufficiently overwhelmed? Okay. Because you're supposed to be.
Yes.
Yeah. You're supposed to be overwhelmed. I mean, I kind of say it jokingly, but really there's a terribly serious point to it. That overwhelmed experience you're having now may be one of the most important parts of your preparation for ministry, to be honest with you. Because if you can get tough enough to get through this, then you're moving along toward being tough enough to make it in the ministry. Because I'm telling you something, you're going to find days in ministry that challenge you. And I remember one time when I was in seminary facing certain things as a youth pastor and saying to myself, well, I think I can make it through this because I've had it slightly harder in seminary. What I've had in seminary has been a little harder than this. And this wasn't very fun or pleasant or easy with a youth group 1,000 miles from home and a girl sexually abused. And you look at that and you go, well, but it's felt harder. Hebrew has felt harder to me. I think I was thinking of Hebrew too. Hebrew has felt harder to me than this. I think I can get through this. If I hadn't had that experience, who knows, I might have folded. So seriously, it's good that it's hard. It's good that it's hard. Besides that, everybody'd want to be a youth pastor. All right, parsing Hebrew verbs. There is the funniest understatement. I mean, there's a tremendous joke in this paragraph. Did you get it? I don't know if you got it or not. I got it. Parsing verbs. In the following chapters, you will learn how to parse Hebrew verbs. Parsing is the process whereby you will identify a verb's stem, conjugation, person, gender, number, and lexical form. For example, the verb nishma. You can already tell that's a nifal, can't you? Right? See how this isn't that hard, is it? Right? Is parsed as and here's the typical form of the parsing: nifal, perfect, third masculine singular, and we'll write 3 ms, right? If it were feminine, we'd write 3FS. If it were second person, we'd write 2MP for plural, right? 3MS from Shema. And then you would write 2 here. Just like in Greek, present active, indicative, third person, plural. So that's parsing. All right? And then at the end of that paragraph it says, you will get plenty of practice parsing verbs in the following chapter. It's pretty funny, isn't it? I like that. That's great. All right, lexical form of Hebrew verbs. Lexical form of any triconsonantal verb is cal form, cal perfect, 3MS. This is also the form of the verb that you will be memorizing as vocabulary. The biconsonantal verbs, however, you will memorize a different lexical form. Okay? Now, the cool thing is, we get some verbs in our vocabulary. That's pretty awesome, huh? How do you find the workbook, by the way? Huh? You're working through the workbook. How's the workbook? It's good? Just to keep you up on my thinking here, I'm considering that there would probably be a really good approach to create the final exam by drawing stuff out of the workbook.
Well, so that's the ones we have to write out in Hebrew.
Yeah.
Now that's not saying that it's like going to cover all the stuff in the workbook, or that it's only going to come from the workbook. But I'm thinking at this point that it might not be a bad idea to rely pretty heavily on the workbook, to come up with the final exam. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, that's great encouragement for working in the workbook, isn't it? And in a sense, it's kind of a way of grading you. Even though you're not being graded on your workbook, but it's kind of a way of grading you on working in your workbook. But it's also probably easier for me to make up a test by just pulling stuff out of there, copying it onto a test and trying to come up with it on my own, So that'd probably be a pretty good method, wouldn't it?
Even easier way to just pass a piece of paper around.
Well, that works sometimes, but for a final, that's not nearly stressful enough. How are we doing on the tape, Carl? Okay, let's get through the vocabulary, and then we'll come back and do some reading in the Bible. We're going to have to start getting into Ruth and see if we can read through Ruth before these 2 terms are up, the book of Ruth, but we won't do that tonight. All right, repeat after me, and we'll go through vocabulary. Akal, to eat. Amar, to say. Somebody parse Amar for me. Cal? Forgot something. Cal perfect 3MS from Amar. That has to do the vocabulary form. To say. Exactly. All right. Now, that's typically going to be the parsing of vocabulary words, right? Because that's a lexical form. Cal perfect 3MS. Whatever the lexical form is, and if you're parsing a lexical form, it's the same as the word, right? Then the meaning of it. All right, halak, to walk. Haya, to be, happen, or become. That's your main verb of being in Hebrew right there. That's your Amy of Hebrew. Okay. Yatsa, to go out or to go forth or come out. All right. Yashav, to sit, dwell, inhabit. Natan, to give. Now, notice these numbers. We've been doing nouns, that have been maybe 100, 200 times, right? Look at these verbs. 2,000 times, 3,500 times, 5,000 times for the verb amar. These are worth knowing, aren't they? Asa, to do, to make. Ra'ah, to see. Shavat, to cease, rest. How are you going to remember that one? Sabbath. Shabbat, Sabbath, means to rest, right? Shema, to hear, or to give ear to, or obey. Obey like when you say to your kid, do you hear me? The Shema, Deuteronomy 6. You ever heard of the Shema? Hear, O Israel. All right, the Lord your God is, the Lord our God is one. Shema Yisrael Adonai Elokeinu Adonai Echad. Echad, you know that one, right? So the Shema starts what? How does the Shema start? Hear. So there you go. So you'll never have to worry about that vocabulary word. Shema. Right? Means to hear. All right, then some nouns. Aron, ark or chest. Mincha, gift, offering. Shabbat, Sabbath, rest. Other kinds of words. Ak, only, surely. All, no or not. Im, if, then. And lo, no or not as well. Lo is the typical word for not. All is going to be used, for example, with the jussive form. So if you see all, that's going to be a marker of jussive. Remember how we had u in the indicative and may outside the indicative? It's a little bit similar here. Okay? All right. Good stuff about and by Ulrich Zwingli. You read that, I hope? Well, it is fairly undeniable that the study of the Bible in the original languages is part of what drove the Reformation. And that itself ought to tell us something. You just hope that there are, in every generation of Christians, even if you think of just American Christians, right? In every generation of American Christians, you hope the church produces some Bible scholars. Because if not, then how many generations is it going to take for us to really start slipping in our understanding of the Bible? Every generation really has to approach the Bible and deal with it and know it and contribute to it on its own. And every generation has to speak to itself in its own terms, right? Otherwise, why worry about preaching? Just play tapes of, D.L. Moody, or I don't think he had tapes back then, but why don't we just have tapes of? Why don't we have tapes of Chuck Swindoll and we can just all play them in our church? Well, people need to hear messages preached to them by someone who knows them. That's part of it too. But you hope in every generation there are also people who might not be totally Bible scholars in the whole ivory tower kind of sense, but at least there are some pastors in every generation who learn the biblical languages well enough to pass them on to the next generation. Right? Because if we ever get to the point as an American church or a church in the world where there aren't so many people who are passing along the biblical languages, what happens? We're going to get to the place where we're going to need another Reformation. So, you are, by doing this, you are contributing mightily to the health of the church now and in the future. I firmly believe it. All right, nice chart, page 137. Takes the verb katal. In the cal stem, it's katal, and then the derived stems, you can see it. Niktal, and this is going to be our paradigm verb, by the way. Isn't that exciting? Niktal, kitale, kutal, hiktil, haktal, hitkatale. Now, can you see in that verb those sounds of those stems and the way the stems are spelled? Nifal, piel, pual, hifil, hofal, and hitpael. You see that?
Well, just all of a sudden it just clicked. When I was reading it for the first time, I thought it was somehow a derivative of column. I kept trying to look at column there. I get column. Yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry. I realized it's vowel points. Sound.
And notice the dogish in the root consonant of the intensive stems. It's all there. Okay, next time we get to talk about verbs, the strong verb, the cal-perfect strong verbs.
So we're one chapter at a time now?
No, I don't think so. I think this was just a respite. I believe that's true. Let me just take a look at my schedule here. Yeah, this is actually week 7, so we're further along in the term than we thought. This is week 7. Week 8, 13 and 14, week 9, 15 and 16, and then week 10 is just 17. So the last day we only cover one chapter. Okay, how long do you need? It's 10 to 8. Can you stand to come back at 8?